and you'll see the red light. It's very obvious. Yes, ma'am. Press it to make it live, and when it's red, it's live.
It always feels weird to sit firsthand, so if we've got enough chairs, I'll sit next to you guys. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody here gets gold stars for sticking around for the final closing session of the conference. So hopefully everybody's had an awesome time. We have actually a fairly packed panel discussion this afternoon. So I want to give you guys a little bit of a background on what this panel is designed to provide you guys, and also want to encourage you guys to think of questions and engage with this group, because we've intentionally left a lot of space in our agenda to make sure that you guys are able to leverage this time to get answers on the particular programs we're going to cover. So we designed this panel initially as a workshop, because as you guys can imagine, in 50-minute panels throughout concurrent sessions, competing with everything else that's at the conference, there's just not enough time to get in the weedy details of some of the very impactful policies for the industry. So something like California LCFS, or as we're going to talk about, biogas regulatory reform, there's just simply not enough time to share the stage with all the other policies that we need to talk about in the industry. So that's why we created this. We have an excellent team of experts all up here. We're going to break this panel into two. So we're going to spend the first half of our time together. This is an extended window. We go till 3:30. We're going to do our first half for biogas reg reform and give all of that time to that topic. And then we're actually going to swap out our panelists. You guys didn't know we were doing disco too, right? Great. So we're going to swap out this panel at the halfway point, and then we're going to bring up the other set of experts to dive into California LCFS. And because we were looking to do this as a workshop, I encourage you guys, if you have questions about something being talked about on the fly, feel free to raise your hand or step to the mic, because we want this to be engaging. If we had the ability to sit roundtable with you guys, that was sort of the vision. This is meant to get into the compliance details of what is on paper today for biogas reg reform. So again, ask questions, feel free to jump into the conversation, raise your hand. And then we are also going to do the same for our California LCFS panel. So this is meant to get you from where you are today in your knowledge to compliant and moving forward with your projects under this new regulatory regime. Okay. So short introduction for myself. If I have not met you yet, my name is Heather Dietzig. I'm the Vice President of Policy for the American Biogas Council, doing all things policy and regulatory for our members with obviously a team of experts. And I'm going to pass the baton down here for some brief introductions to these panelists. Obviously, their bios are in the app for all of their wonderful backgrounds, but just to let them introduce themselves with respect to biogas reg reform and what roles they play in the industry and in the supply chain and in their service to members with respect to reg reform. So, Tim, I'll start with you.
Tim Johnson with Raceline Alternative Energy. I think I'm on the panel because I've been a measurement engineer for a long time, and the set rule came up and EPA thought they were measurement engineers and specified some protocols for all of us to use for measuring our renewable natural gas. They specified stuff nobody uses, but that's why they're not measurement engineers. That's why I'm on. I've also done a fair amount of work with gas chromatographs and that kind of thing. So,
awesome. Thanks, Tim. Ashley P.
Yes, I'm Ashley Player with Weaver. Weaver is a full-service accounting firm, but I lead our technical group of chemical engineers, and I have my PE license. So I've been in the RFS providing engineering review and QAP services for over a decade. And at Weaver, we have been focusing on all aspects of biogas reg reform and how they impact participants at the biogas side, RNG producer side, marketing, and ultimately dispensing as CNG or LNG, and helping our clients figure out what they need to do to update their operations to be able to generate RINs in 2025.
Thanks, Ashley. Ashley D.
You sure you don't want to take a stab at it?
I don't. Duplashane? Okay.
Hi. I'm Ashley Duplachin from U.S. Energy. Thank you guys for being here. The few, the proud, the highly caffeinated at this point. Yeah, glad to have you guys here. I think it needs to be said that this topic needs to be an ongoing and highly interactive issue. So as important as it is to have you guys here, plan to keep talking about this multiple times a week, I think, for the next several months. This is a pretty big deal. Technically, U.S. Energy is a pretty vertically integrated company, so I could arguably, be coming at it from a couple of different angles, but technically I'm here on this panel serving as someone representing the RIN separator point of view.
All right. Michael?
Hi, Michael Bell with Weaver. I'm a partner in our Energy Compliance Services group, work closely with Ashley, providing regulatory compliance consulting and advisory. Also an engineer, so focused really on helping our clients register new facilities under the program so they can generate their RINs, and working a lot in the QAP space as well.
Thanks, Michael. And Brad.
Hey everyone, Brad Plima with Eco Engineers, and do a lot of the similar stuff as Ashley and Michael said, but we're helping people with their existing pathways comply under the new regulation, new facilities. What do they need to do differently? That the changing regulation. We're also helping a lot of people with compliance. We're also one of two QAP providers in the RNG space and in the renewable fuel space as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. So I think it's fair to say that biogas reg reform is probably one of the largest sweeping compliance actions that we've seen for the industry in many years. Probably analogous to some of the initial framework of the RFS, et cetera. So for an industry that is not accustomed to what I would say very rigorous compliance metrics, targets, pathways, and creating compliance strategies, right? From blank page to compliant RIN generating project. This is often new, right? For especially for small companies that are new to the biogas industry. So I want to start, for those in the room that haven't been on this train with us since the set rule came out, to touch a little bit just on 101. So just get everybody in the room on a baseline on what are we talking about when we talk about biogas reg reform. And I think I'm going to toss it to Michael first. We'll sort of start upstream. If you could touch on, like, what are we talking about when we say compliance requirements? What is new that a producer or anybody else upstream would have had to engage with that they wouldn't have years ago?
Yes, so feels like we've been talking about this for a long time now, but it's taken a lot of discussion to kind of figure out some of the nuances, so that's good. But yes, so it was a quick kind of recap of where we are and what's expected coming up. As part of EPA's set rule, they pushed out a new program called Biogas Regulatory Reform. Really, the purpose is to restructure the program such that more than one individual in the chain of biogas to RNG to CNG, LNG use has to register under the program now, and report certain information related to their specific activities. So that is different from what we are currently doing up until maybe July 1 or through the end of the year for existing facilities, where there is just one registered entity as the RIN generator for a facility and for a pathway. And that entity is required to do the reporting for RIN generation and their obligations as well. There are still other entities involved right now that may be RIN marketers, and involved to some extent with what happens to the RIN after it's generated. But really, it's a lot of the requirements related to RIN generation are currently focused on the RIN generator. And maybe that's a marketer, maybe that's the producer of the RNG at the facility. So these new regulatory requirements are requiring that there is now a biogas producer. You can think of that as the raw gas producer, but there's a specific definition for biogas producer. That entity now has to register for each site. There's an RNG producer, so the finished RNG product that's being delivered into the commercial system. That entity has to register, and that entity is now the only entity that is allowed to generate RINs, at least within the US as a domestic producer. So no longer can any other entity generate those RINs. It is the RNG producer, and they are generating RINs on a monthly basis at the time of pipeline injection, not necessarily dispensing as CNG, LNG. Then any entity in the chain of transfer of that RNG until it is dispensed as CNG, LNG also has to register in EPA system and will have reporting requirements, buys and sells of RINs and transactions within the system. Those entities have to have, they have their own reporting requirements now. They'll have to have attestations. So a lot of new requirements that they did not previously have. So I guess in terms of timeline, legacy facilities, so facilities that are registered with EPA and have a facility ID prior to July 1 are able to continue generating RINs under the program as they are currently doing through the end of this year. Facilities registered after July 1 are required to meet all of the new biogas regulatory reform requirements, and they must start generating RINs under that new methodology moving forward. So legacy facilities have until October 1st to submit updated registrations showing how they will conform with the new requirements beginning January 1 of 2025. So we are quickly approaching that deadlines. We'll talk more about some of the open questions items we have that we need clarification from EPA on. So there's a lot of work to get done throughout the end of this year.
All right. So you went about 4 agenda items deep there.
I'm sorry.
So for all of you wondering about the requirements and the changes that Michael is alluding to and what needs to go into those plans, we will cover that. We'll get there in just a moment. But I appreciate the reference point for timing, right? It's part of the reason why we're here today is to make sure that this industry understands what's ahead of us in the near term, and that we get this information. If you've not been talking to folks like these at the table already, and you have legacy facilities or you want to start moving with projects, the time is ticking, clock is ticking. So Ashley P., on the downstream side, is there anything Michael didn't cover with respect to notable changes, roles and responsibilities that you'd like to note in terms of the Biogas Reform 101?
Yeah, so for high level 101, if you're currently a CNG dispenser, right now, you just need to sign a quarterly affidavit and provide your monthly pipeline statements for your dispensing activities to whoever is reviewing that information. And you don't have to have an account with EPA. You don't need to file any reports with EPA. You don't need a responsible corporate officer set up with EPA. But under biogas reg reform, you will be buying RINs in EPA's system that are assigned RINs or K1 RINs. That's a new term for the industry to talk about K1 RINs versus K2 RINs. That is related to whether that RIN is attached to a physical commodity or not. A K1 RIN is attached or assigned to physical renewable fuel that is bought and sold. And a K2 RIN has had a qualifying event that has allowed that entity to separate the RIN from physical fuel. And a K2 RIN is what can be traded free of any physical worldly obligations attached to it, and then ultimately retired by an obligated party to satisfy the RVO for that obligated party. So the dispensers have a new registration requirement, new reporting requirement, and attestation requirement as well. And we're getting very close to those registrations needing to be submitted and accepted by EPA to allow for them to start buying and separating and selling RINs.
All right. Anything else on rules and responsibilities that the panel wants to touch on in terms of new players engaged in this chain? I know we've got a lot of title changes, but do we actually have any new entities that are engaged here? Or is it just a lot of naming and assigning responsibility to the roles that already exist today? Brad's raising his hand.
I think that there are, especially on the biogas producer side, as Michael was saying, some of these, it might be a county landfill or it might be a dairy owner. If the digester or the biogas production facility is under a different owner or facility. So think about the benefit of the current system is that one RNG producer, that one pathway holder is still coordinating with all of these various parties. It's just going to be a more formalized process. You have to be registered with EPA and EMTS. But now going forward, you may have the RNG producer might have to work with a county landfill to get registered under EPA. They have to have a company ID. They need to establish a responsible corporate officer, and they have compliance obligations under this new version of the regulation where they had none of that before. And so that education process should be happening now, or there's some provisions within the regulation I think we'll get into later where that could be delegated or another entity could take over. So it's possible for one entity to be the biogas producer and the RNG producer, but in many cases, those are going to be separated out. And that is going to be very different for people that are not used to dealing with EPA, dealing with EMTS, dealing with compliance filing. So certainly that's a challenge in the industry, is to make sure that those entities know what they need to do, and then they actually go through and follow through on all the compliance obligations that they now have.
Ashley D., you had a thought as well.
Sure, yeah, sort of adding on to what Brad said, I think maybe the quiet part that's not necessarily being stated overtly is with that redistribution of responsibilities is also a redistribution of risk. And so I think that is something that is potentially not being talked about enough, and I think is going to lead to a lot of long discussions about having to do some amending of contracts. That I think there's going to be a flurry of activity of that over the next several months. And I think generally speaking, some of us who have sort of lived in that lightning rod role, so to speak, where, you know, we've sort of been the central point of contact and touching all the different various players. Ideally, the thought is to try to keep things going as close to normal as possible, but that still doesn't, at the end of the day, change the fact that now, yes, all of these different entities are going to have to be registered and a lot more directly engaged.
So I'm going to pull on the risk thread a little bit. So when you look at a redistribution of risk, are we talking about compliance with these rules and that risk, and risk of noncompliance, I guess, liability for the RINs themselves and their validity, all of the above? Help us understand a little bit more about that risk.
Yeah, and I'm sure my friends here from the various QAP houses can talk more about this, but yes, it then leaves opportunities open at each point along the value chain for something to effectively go wrong. So data integrity is also going to be a major issue here. And unfortunately, if something goes wrong upstream, it can have some precipitating effects all the way down. So, you know, I anticipate that there will probably be some unfortunate occurrences early on here as we readjust to this new reality, but hopefully we'll get past that pretty quickly.
So on the risk side of things.
Got a question?
Oh,
No, you're good. Jump in. Yeah, have at it. Just give me one of these so I notice you. Yeah, there you go. Go ahead.
Going to the biogas producer, I guess, that Brad was talking about, has EPA provided any distinction? I'll take a very specific example. If you have a farm with a lagoon being covered with biogas, the lagoon is owned by the farm. Are they considered a biogas producer, or if the R&D operator who also operates that cover of the lagoon is actually using the biogas, are they considered biogas?
the definition of the biogas producer includes several different roles. So owning the facility that is producing the biogas is the first role, but the order of the roles does not indicate order of preference. It's just a list of roles that if you fit into one of those categories, owning, operating, controlling, supervising, then you can register as that biogas producer. Only one entity can register at a time as that biogas producer. But if the RNG producer is supervising and going over to the facility and making sure it's operating properly and checking for any rips in the cover on the lagoon and making sure only the qualifying manure is entering the digester, that supervision of the facility can qualify to register the facility. So what we tell people is you need to, you can register it. Make sure everyone who could register it is in agreement that you're the right one and that you should be the one to do this registration, because we don't want duplicate registrations happening either. It could be an entity who doesn't hold title to biogas at all, could be the biogas producer under the program. So they could qualify to register for that role and report for that role, even if they don't hold title to the biogas. It's kind of weird with that opportunity. But from a risk standpoint, they added several new sections to the regulations around what can invalidate a RIN for RNG and who is liable for that invalid RIN. And it's multiple parties in that chain that can be held liable if that RIN gets invalidated based on one company's actions. And there's also a clause that says an invalidly separated RIN is an invalid RIN. And so it's very important that everyone who holds title to the RNG in the chain, the biogas producer who's overseeing the biogas production and reporting that in the system, they're all reporting in compliance and not causing anyone else to wind up with an invalid RIN in their account.
So I think I just heard a biogas or business biogas topic, which is contract revisions for biogas or RIN liability. So yeah. So I want to get into some of the nitty gritty on what I would consider equipment specs, right? And how all of this data validation and integrity is being achieved, at least in the eyes of EPA. And to get back to Tim's point about systems being dictated that are not realistic, et cetera. And before I jump into sort of the actual project impacts and boots on the ground, I think it might be helpful for somebody on the panel who feels comfortable to just give us a rundown of the equipment that we're talking about. Like, where in the system are specific engineering specs being dictated under this rule? And Tim can take it.
So one of the things about having the biogas generator separated from the RNG generator or the RNG producer is that you now have to have measurement between those 2 points. We're hoping that if that's the same person, maybe we don't have to have measurement there. But the current rule looks like you have to have a meter in there, and you also have to have a way to tell how much methane is in the gas so that you can take the cubic feet of gas you're measuring and multiply by the percentage of methane and get a methane number, cubic feet of methane. Then there's another meter, the one we've all had for a long time, coming out of the RNG production facility and going into usually into a pipeline or into a virtual pipeline. That part's not changing as far as the need for it, but what changed was the need for the kind of the measurement devices piece. So yes.
So I'm going to repeat that for the folks in the back that can't hear it. So I'm going to simplify it, but does it matter who owns the meter that you've just referenced, front or back end?
It doesn't matter who owns the meter, but whoever is reporting to EPA using that meter is obligated to keep the records related to that meter, that it's in compliance, that they hold an alternative measurement protocol for that meter if it's not under one of the specified standards. And they've got the 1-minute flow data from the meter or the 15-minute GC data from the GC or methane analyzer, because the one that is reporting that information is the one responsible for it being in compliance.
So with respect to these meters and measurement, continuous monitoring, et cetera, there have been challenges, which you alluded to, of what is actually available on the market, what can projects actually procure in terms of equipment, the skill or training to operate those pieces of equipment, all of which are not clear, and there are gaps. So can you, for those that aren't dealing with this already, can you explain what those gaps are currently, and then we'll get into maybe some of the AMP and then how to solve those. So we'll go Tim and then Brad.
I just real quick before Tim can jump into the details. I think it's important to note the guidance that came out from EPA a month ago or so that treats existing pathways, kind of what Michael said. If you have an existing pathway or if you're under construction prior to July 1st, there's some lessening. The language is softened about what you could potentially use to comply. And I think if you read the set rule from last year, there's only 3 types of meters that aren't necessarily commonly used in RNG, and it didn't say it explicitly, but basically you had to have a full gas chromatograph and a wide range of testing parameters in order to meet the set rule. EPA put out guidance last month that softens it and maybe kind of dumbing it down, basically said for existing facilities, you can use a financial hardship, or you can submit an alternative approach to meeting the regulations. And again, oversimplifying it, but basically, are you meeting the intent of what the regulation says? And instead of just using one of those 3 meters or a full GC on the raw biogas, I think the industry is looking at other different types of meters will likely be allowable under the set rule to meet the requirements, and likely not a full gas chromatograph, maybe an analyzer, and maybe not even measure the full constituent panel that's listed in the regulation. And we're waiting on EPA, and part of that guidance, they said they're going to publish some of the equipment, some specifications that that you can point to when you re-register that they're allowing to meet that for existing and facilities currently under construction. We don't know any of that. Nothing that list hasn't been fully put out there yet. But I think the general consensus is: are you metering this, and are you measuring the quality, and are you meeting the data capture standards, and are you storing that data? That's really what a lot of people are pointing to and hoping that there will be a relaxing of the formal requirements in the set rule for many of these existing facilities, especially now. You talk October 1st as a timeline. There's not a lot of, you're not going to order a GC and install it likely right now and meet that timeline. So I think that's really what the industry is banking on, is EPA to start approving those or to start publishing more information. And we were talking just before we started, maybe, hopefully here in the next several weeks, that the information starts to come out about what some of those allowable alternate setups are and these alternative measurement protocols will look like. So everyone's still in a little bit of a wait and see mode to see what equipment exactly is needed.
So I'm going to step back and come back to you, Tim, on, I think we'll get into some of the flexibility in AMPs here in a minute, but can you just describe where's the rub, right? Well, these 3 meters that were articulated, and the industry doesn't use those. What's the issue? Just explain sort of why people are having heartburn over what was on paper before, I guess, pre-guidance.
Sure. So the 3 measurement, and they weren't actually meters that were specified, it was measurement protocols that were specified. And with the meters that meet those 3 measurement protocols are common meters in some parts of the oil and gas business, but not in the kind of systems like we're all familiar with. So going to Brad's point about the existing systems, almost all of us that are producing RNG producers, we're producing gas, putting it into a pipeline, and the common meter that's being used for that is a Coriolis meter. That was not on the protocol list. So it was going to invalidate, probably 95% of the injection meters out there. Now that they're saying that we're going to be able to hopefully just leave those out there. There is a 2-part test. You have to prove first that you can't use one of their meters and financial testing is part of that. And then secondly, you have to prove that the meter you're putting in is as good or better than the ones that EPA specified. That's a pretty low bar given the meters that they specified. The meters that they specified were older meters that are not, they're not modern technology. They don't really meet the criteria. The other big issue that we've got is with having to measure, and Brad mentioned that as well, having to measure that gas coming out of the digesters into the RNG upgrade systems is a real challenge. Raceline, we do mostly swine farms, and so we're covering lagoons, and our lagoons are running anywhere from 3/4 of an inch of water column pressure, so really low pressure. An orifice meter, which was one of the meters that EPA specified, you've got to measure the differential across an orifice, and that differential across the orifice is measured in inches of water column. And we're only putting in 1/10 of an inch of water column pressure into it. So obviously you can't do that. That was the kind of problems that we were running into with the measurement that was specified. Same thing with the GC. The only way you could do a GC off of a low pressure system like that would be to put a little pump in to actually extract your sample and send it to the GC. So it was just a number of real technical issues, particularly with the biogas producer to RNG producer piece. That was going to be really difficult. The other side's not going to be as difficult, but it also was going to mean everybody was going to have to do an AMP, an alternative measurement protocol. So I think we're going to get through this. I went around and did a little survey of everybody downstairs that sells meters, and they've all put in alternative measurement protocols, all of the manufacturers of the meters. And they're all hearing that we're going to hear sometime soon, 3 to 4 weeks, hopefully, that those have been approved. Ashley actually talked to EPA and the American Gas Association to try to get some more measurement protocols put in as valid protocols. That'll help a lot, including, I think AGA 11 is the one that covers Coriolis meters. So that's one of the ones we definitely wanted to do. Some others that I think we're going to want to get in for those of you who are putting gas into distribution systems. We're probably going to look at trying to get rotary meters in there as well, and some other ultrasonic meters I think are also going to be hopefully going to be approved.
So you guys are jumping into AMPs, so we're just going to go there. No, that's fine. That's where we're headed next. So you covered some of the issues that, what's on paper in the regs creates some of the issues that, projects cannot overcome. The solution, which both you and Brad alluded to, is this AMP. And there is a process, which you guys also alluded to go to EPA, submit these alternatives, submit information that they are sufficiently meeting the requirement and or the intent of the monitoring requirements. But can you guys go through just the logistics, right? Like if I'm a vendor, I'm an equipment manufacturer, I'm a project owner, biogas producer, where do I start? Do I call EPA? Is there a form? Is there a website, right? Like what does somebody need to do? Just walk us through the basics of how an AMP is supposed to be submitted.
Yeah, that's a great question. So EPA in their recent webinar alluded to it, and they also put out a document that kind of explains what they're looking for. But it's what's kind of evolved as sort of a two-step process. So what they're ultimately looking for is any registered facility, a biogas producer, RNG producer, that is not able to meet one of those explicitly listed meter standards, then has to submit an AMP required for each of their facilities as needed. So ultimately, an AMP will need to be submitted for each facility that is not able to comply with the specifically listed standards. But EPA also does not want the same documentation for the same meter submitted in every single registration that is submitted to them. All 100 pages of those documents explaining why the meter is precise, accurate, reliable. So what they are asking for is kind of an initial AMP to be submitted to them. What they're looking for really is submittal of a specific standard, measurement standard, or a specific kind of equipment measurement device that is including all the support that would be needed, which is the standard that's being used, explanation of how this device is applicable for the type of measurement needed in the industry, so measurement of biogas or RNG type materials, and then a description and data supporting the accuracy, precision, reliability of these meters, maintenance requirements, a lot of information that is, I'm sure some of you are familiar with as you've had to work through this process. So that is all being submitted in advance. A lot of that has happened, as was noted already. And the idea is EPA would be able to accept those in advance, and then on an individual basis, the biogas producers, RNG producers would be able to point to those previously accepted AMPs for a standard or a specific device and say, okay, you've already approved this. Now we are also including in our site-specific AMP that additional information, which is, okay, we are not able to buy a new GC and install it to replace our analyzer, for example, for these specific reasons. It's cost prohibitive. It doesn't make sense for the configuration of our facility and would require a lot of downtime. They've given some examples of what that might look like. But then that would be the ultimate step, is putting together that site-specific AMP and pointing back, hopefully to the previously accepted AMP for that specific meter or standard.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm hearing two different AMPs, right? So we have folks like you guys and vendors, OEMs that Tim has alluded to, that are submitting AMPs independent of any particular project or biogas production facility. But those by themselves, even if approved by EPA, are not sufficient for a project to be in compliance or to be considered having an AMP. So is it true that if I am a biogas producer doing a project, while those might have been quote unquote pre-approved, I am still obligated to submit my own project AMP? I can reference those to hopefully speed up the process, but I still have to do one.
Yes, that's a good point to note. So it is ultimately the obligation of the biogas producer, RNG producer, to make sure their AMPs are submitted and point back, hopefully, to an AMP for a specific meter type that was accepted by EPA. So it's important for everybody to be communicating, working closely together on these. If you're unsure, if specific meters have had AMPs submitted by the OEMs or other entities, I wouldn't just assume that's the case. Many have been submitted, but it's important to really run that down, reach out to us or the manufacturer and see if that's what the status of that is and if it's something you would be able to utilize for your specific application.
Ashley P.
I may be getting a little ahead in the agenda, I'm not
You're
sure,
okay.
but the metering, we've been talking about it on the upstream side, biogas, RNG, and the section of the regulations is 80.155. So like they'll say, hey, 80.155, that's the measurement section talking about these specified standards. So one hiccup is that the CNG and LNG RIN separators also reference back to 80.155 and are also subject to an AMP if they're not using the specified meters and a GC at a CNG station, which we all know no CNG station has an inline GC sampling the natural gas that's withdrawn from the pipeline. It's pointless to do that. It's going to be what it's going to be. So I just wanted to bring that up and open the door to talk downstream as well.
Yes, yeah, and I think we need to pull Ashley D in here because I think there's some role conversations. This goes all the way back to where we started, right? Which is, there's probably some multi-role entities, right, that we didn't really cover about, these don't have to be 6 different people or 6 different businesses. And I think actually in your position, having played multiple roles in this chain, can you just help us understand a little bit about how to maybe streamline if you're one of those multi-role entities, and then also to Ashley's point about the dispensing compliance and how the equipment specs are impacting these dispensers.
Sure. So I think I'll do that in reverse and start by specifically addressing what AP just said. For me, the really beautifully funny part of all of that is the standard right now is you're using meter data from an unbiased third party, and the rewritten regs seem to be pushing you in the direction of a self-monitored meter, but that was all driven by a fear of fraud. So there's some laughter to be had there. Anyway, so once we all stacked hands on the fact that that was a bit ridiculous, Ashley and Nicole, both from Weaver, were kind enough to actually write a generalized AMP for the RIN separation side of things. So I believe a 1A and 1B version for CNG, where you can either keep things as they've been going and just rely once again on your utility meter, or second, just using your dispenser data, and then 2.0 being the LNG. And I think that was just going off of weight. That I'll keep it simple. But anyway, that's already been written by some really smart people. I think it has been sent to EPA by one industry group so far. I don't know that that is enough to get EPA's attention and actually move that forward and getting some sort of approval. So what we were just discussing privately was possibly my organization, some others, sending in that generalized AMP along with some station registrations or re-registrations. And once those are accepted, then that should sort of be like, oh, this is now kosher, we're good to go. So hopefully that is going to be a lot less controversial and onerous in comparison to everything that's going on upstream, because I do think out of the two, the upstream problem was way more complicated and needed the bulk of the attention, if I'm being completely honest. So also then to answer your question about roles and responsibilities, what again is really unfortunate is with the way that contracts were written over the last several years and how these business deals have been approached, a lot of the folks downstream, they simply don't have a compliance team that is well-versed in the RFS because they never needed to. And so we're trying to figure out ways to, once again, just keep things as similar to how they have been flowing as possible. So exploring ways to amend existing agreements to establish either the marketer or someone else upstream who's been doing this every day, all day, as acting as their agent. And so I think that's going to become a pretty common approach going forward. One other thing worth saying, if there are any CNG or LNG station owners, I personally don't love the written description of who could qualify as the registered party for CNG or LNG dispensing. As Ashley was saying earlier, they do have, I think it's a description of 3 parties that could potentially register for your RIN separation. And even though they are numbered, they are not, there's no established hierarchy. And so by default, that then moves away from the concept of the asset owner being the default person having the absolute right to separate those RINs. So that is a conversation we're starting to have with all of our third-party dispensing customers of, hey, you know, if you want to absolutely make sure that you're retaining your right to be separating RINs on your property at your CNG station, we're probably going to want to get on this sooner rather than later.
And to add to that concern on the dispensing side of things and controlling what's happening on your property, because there's no hierarchy, but there is a provision in the regulations that says that only one entity is allowed to register a station location, a dispensing location at a time for a reporting period. EPA has said that their system is set up that if someone has already registered a station location, no one else would be able to register that station location. And so that's That's good in some ways where you're like, okay, that's good. It'll stop people from registering and double reporting, double counting, dispensing activities. But in other ways, it sets it up to be first come, first serve for who's registering dispensing assets for the industry.
So we're going to ask 2 more questions up here, and then I'm gonna go to the audience because we're getting amazingly tight on time, surprisingly. So we could go for more hours, I'm sure. So I guess it's technically upstream, but I want to jump there anyway, just briefly, with a question to Tim on utility interconnects. And we were relying a lot, I think, as an industry on the expertise and the interconnection equipment, including GCs, for that final meter. And it seems now that maybe there's not only duplication, there's redundancy, but now there's maybe 2 separate data sets, right? You've got a project level GC meter that might be your RIN compliance or your RFS compliance meter, but you still are obligated to put in whatever the utility is asking you to put in, right, for their spec and their pipeline interconnect. And so 2 questions. One is, have you seen any positive discussions in your work with AGA or others on streamlining those 2 specs to have utilities start to adopt something that walks and talks like EPA's requirements? And to the rest of the group, is there any concern about 2 meters, or are we just ignoring the redundant meter that is now on the utility side of these interconnects?
So I got to think about the answer to that question because so this thing kind of got kicked off a little bit with the American Gas Association Gas Transmission Conference or committee meeting in January. I did a presentation about this to those guys, and everybody in the room was appalled. They said, well, we're not going to take out our Coriolis meters and put in orifice meters, which I think is a logical response. But I hadn't really thought about the fact, what you're saying, that now they're going to be essentially part of that whole chain. And so I think that probably the best solution would be if we can get EPA to accept Coriolis meters. Otherwise, we're going to need to go to the pipelines and say, we'd like to have all of you register. Sounds like a serious problem. So otherwise, you're right. We end up with 2 meters, probably 2 meters that look identical. Raceline's actually been doing that for a long time. We've got a meter on the outlet of each one of our biogas upgrade skids. What's interesting is they don't always match. And so then you've got to figure out, which one do you use? The tradition has been that you use the pipeline company's meter, and because that's sort of the official third-party meter, which is the way the spec was written. But that may need to change now. And I don't know what you do if you have a discrepancy. We'd have to go through. I think you could potentially end up with a certain amount of essentially brown gas being put into the pipeline and a different amount of RINs being generated based on the 2 different meters. But yeah, that is going to be an issue.
Okay. Ashley?
From a QAP perspective and from an independent engineering review perspective, we currently have, these requirements around measuring. And then we have a different section of the regulations that talks about batch reporting and how you're going to report the BTUs of your batch. And the regulations, shockingly, are not super consistent. And they do refer sometimes to say, for example, you could say in your RIN generation protocol that you're going to wait until you receive your pipeline statements before you generate RINs. And so there's nothing in the regulations right now that says you're going to have this meter, you're going to have this GC, and then you're also going to have to compare it to your utility statement. That doesn't say, word for word in the regulations, you're going to need to do that. However, our experience with EPA and with submitting registration materials is that they come up with things that they want to see in registrations before they accept them. And the RIN generation protocol has been something that gets filed with legacy facility registrations, but now it's actually part of the registration requirements in the regulations, and it's actually part of the engineering review, that the engineer needs to review your RIN generation protocol, and it's attached to the report that gets submitted to EPA by the PE. And so I can imagine a scenario where EPA starts reviewing these BRR registrations and BRR RIN generation protocols, and they say, oh, yeah, you need to note how you're going to confirm it was actually injected into the commercial distribution system. And our interpretation of that is you're going to have to compare it to the pipeline statement. And they're free to do that. They're free to interpret it that way and hold up registrations as long as they want. They have no deadline to approve anyone's registration. So it doesn't say anything in the regulations right now. You're going to get your pipeline statement, you're going to make a comparison, and then you're going to go with the lower of the two, for example. But that is something that EPA could decide they want to do. And that as a QAP provider, we also develop quality assurance plans that we file with EPA, and EPA will say, oh, we want you to check on this. We want you to make this comparison here and make sure they're not generating RINs that way. And it's something that's not clearly, laid out and described in the regulations, but then it becomes the industry standard because they enforce it and interpret it through their processing of the QAP plants.
Yeah, I think hopefully practicality wins out in this, and I think everyone is hoping that the pipeline meter information, the quality equipment that's currently been used, that's been used for all 250, 300 facilities, can be, can be used and approved under this new version, and that's the intent. I think that's the best case scenario, and I think that's the practical good answer here. But as Ashley said, you never quite know what EPA will come up with. I think that's probably the path that people are going to take first. And these first few processes and submittals are going to be really important because EPA does like precedent. And once that gets set, it gets harder and harder to get them off of what they've approved before. And so I think that's why there's so much of this effort going on right now to try to get this as correct and as practical as possible, while still meeting the intent of what EPA is trying to do. I don't think anyone's really arguing what EPA wants to accomplish out of this. It makes sense to understand raw biogas quality and understand finished RNG, make sure there's nothing being added in the process. It's just EPA has also said their intent really is not to disrupt the entire process. They're doing that a little bit in certain areas, but I think if common sense and practicality wins out, hopefully there won't be too many changes, but I don't know. Nobody knows that. EPA hasn't given that confirmation. But the next month to 2 months, when some of these start going in, or some of these AMPs start being published, we're going to know a lot more about what we think EPA's intent will be. But hopefully, again, there won't have to be drastic changes on the injection side. That's the hope anyway.
Certainly want to wrap up in terms of the next steps, but before we do that, as sort of a nice final statement, I do want to open the floor to everybody out there to ask questions. Looks like Bernie's going to be our MC here.
Round to you.
Questions from the audience? Raise your hand if you're overwhelmed. Got a couple ones floating up there. There we go.
Has anybody, has a pipeline company just come out and said we are, you can't use our meter for ring compliance? Has any pipeline company said that yet? That you've heard of?
I mean, so the complications with trying to register relying on the pipeline meter as your 80.155 meter is access to the continuous data from the pipeline. on that 1-minute frequency or 15-minute frequency, access to any maintenance and calibration records to prove out how it's staying in compliance with 80.155. Those are the complications of trying to use that meter. But to the earlier question around who owns the meter, the regulations don't say you have to own the meter at 80.155. So the utility meter could be the one that you register to say this is going to be my rent generation basis. You would just need to have an AMP that walks through why that meter is the one you're going to use and what the frequency of the data available to you is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good action item for everybody that has existing pathways is talk to the utility and see if they'll give you access. I know many of you get direct access. You can see their SCADA. They allow that access to be had. I think Ashley mentioned it earlier, you're going to have to be the data keeper, the record keeper of this. And so if you're going to use the pipeline's meter and chromatograph, hopefully that should work. But you do need access to all of that data, and you need to store that for the required period, and make sure that's visible to you and you can store it.
I'm curious if EPA has given any guidance on the requirements for gas to have physical gas in association with a K1 RIN, and if there's any permitted gaps between the ownership of gas and the ownership of K1 RINs, and what's your answer to that question?
I feel like we might need one of those like bells for a boxing ring now, because I think the two providers here have slightly different viewpoints on this. So y'all go ahead and fight it out.
Oh, it's time. Well, what are we going to do? No. I don't know. What's that? Yeah, it's a question that I think both of us have been asking EPA for clarification. We can both interpret things, we can guess, and we do have different opinions on maybe what's, again, maybe conservative, what's practical, what the intent was. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what ECO's intent versus Weaver's intent. It matters what EPA really is going to say. So we've made progress on that. I think at least getting them submitting official questions. I know Ashley was saying too, you started to get some answers to some of your questions. ECO started to finally get some answers to questions, maybe not all the big ones that we really, really need, but they are starting to respond in writing, which is usually a good sign. They're willing to put some of this down and answer some of these questions, where for the last 6, 8, 12 months, it's been a little bit of a black hole where you just ask questions and they say, yeah, we didn't really think about that. Let us go back and talk about it. We're starting to get some of those answers, but that question on physical storage is one that hopefully they need to provide clarification on that. Otherwise, we're all just going to be guessing and judging intent.
I just had a thought, actually, and I'm sure you'll. Anyway, I'm wondering if, as part of RINGEN protocol, you could explicitly say, I am just going to store as a K1 RIN, and see if that gets a stamp of approval or not.
I've submitted this question to EPA 5 different ways from different angles. I haven't submitted it under different user accounts yet, but that's my next step. So the basic question is, by definition, a K1 RIN is assigned to renewable fuel. And so renewable natural gas is this esoteric concept after injection where it exists on the system, but doesn't exist anywhere in particular on the system. And so what do you, as a K1 RIN buyer, K1 RIN owner, K1 RIN seller, what do you need to do to comply with holding a K1 RIN? Because it is assigned to renewable fuel, it is attached to renewable fuel, but what is renewable fuel when we're talking about a commercial distribution system? the difference in opinion is really that there are two options, and we've both asked which one EPA wants. That's all we want, is for EPA to clarify which one they want. So the first interpretation is, because it is attached, assigned to physical gas, if you own a K1 RIN, you need to own equivalent BTU of natural gas somewhere on the commercial distribution system for those RINs to be attached to, for you to hold them. The other interpretation is that because RNG is fungible with all natural gas on the pipeline system, and the quantity was confirmed at injection of that RNG, a K1 RIN for RNG can be bought, held, and sold without that owner of the K1 RIN owning any physical commodity.
Yeah, I think we've liquid fuels makes perfect sense. You know, ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, that makes sense. I think our thought or maybe interpretation, hope, is that the gaseous fuels are just so different than liquid fuels. But I think Ashley summed it up well of what the different positions are. I think holding, you know, physical molecules just to check a box, I think that's maybe not a practical way to go about this, but it's probably the intent of what the rule said. And so there's more of this practicality versus the actual regulation, and that interpretation is really what we need to determine exactly, do you need a physical position and physical molecule in order to tie that with your RIN generation. We'll see. Hopefully soon we get some answers.
Great. You had another question?
Yeah. Regarding the AMPs, there was a mention of all the OEMs putting in the AMPs. Is there going to be a database, or have they talked about some sort of searchable database for the biogas producers and RIN producer or RNG producers being able to search that to be able to match up the accepted protocols with the ones we're using?
Well, we have a spreadsheet, but it would probably be something for like the ABC, like an industry organization, to maintain something like that would be accessible to their members. But it's a temporary need, hopefully, as well, because hopefully it will become publicly available which ones EPA has approved on their website.
Yeah, so, and we did speak with EPA about that as well. And so whether it's a laundry list of approvals that you need to just know, oh, go to this document with this tag number or whatever to know that that's the one that you need, or whether it's searchable by equipment type in an actual user-friendly database, I think that's TBD, but it was communicated by EPA that wasn't their intent. That was their intent, was to be timely with every approval to be publicly accessible. I think the early iteration is going to be like just a data dumping ground on a website, but we can certainly encourage them to be more thoughtful with that. Other questions? One over there?
Yeah, actually I have two questions. The first one, you talked about legacy facilities. You could give me a definition of what a legacy facility is. And the second one is on the constituents that need to be measured. I know there's, obviously it's methane, but what other constituents are being asked by the EPA to be measured?
Yeah, so legacy facilities, kind of the term being used to describe any facility that is registered prior to July 1 of this year under the regulations. So that is a facility that is generating RINs at the time the CNG and LNG is confirmed to have been dispensed as a transportation fuel, as opposed to facilities registered under biogas regulatory reform after July 1, which are generating RINs based on RNG injected on a monthly basis into the commercial system. So that's the difference, or the use of the legacy is basically a facility that is operating under the old regulations. And those legacy facilities are able to continue that process for production through the end of this year. And then they are forced to begin RINs under the new methodology beginning 2025. So in terms of measurement of gas constituents, from a RIN generation standpoint, EPA is requiring that RINs only be generated on the biomethane content of the RNG injected into the commercial system. So of your RNG and utilizing that to get to your lower heating value MMBTU is what you should be measuring to generate your RINs off of. You're also measuring the biomethane content of your biogas to report as a biogas producer the quantity of biogas you're producing each month. In terms of the new annual gas sampling requirement, so taking a step back, under legacy registrations, a facility has to submit gas quality analysis showing that they are meeting pipeline spec. And they have to do that testing for both biogas and RNG. And at present, they're just saying test to the pipeline spec for the specific pipeline you're delivering your gas into. Under biogas regulatory reform, that is not required to initially register a facility under the program, but it is now an annual requirement to have that testing conducted. So the RNG and the biogas, I believe it is the RNG producer's requirement to actually conduct that testing of both the RNG and the biogas. And they've really expanded the testing requirements, and now they say, okay, in addition to testing for whatever the specific pipeline is requiring, you must also test these kind of laundry list of additional requirements. Some of them are probably things a typical pipeline is looking for. Some of them are probably not, like a C14 test. And they do have specific testing standards that they are requesting or requiring you to use for those. They also have a specific standard that they are requiring you use for the actual physical sampling collection of the sample to be tested. So I forget the exact section of the regs, but those are all listed out. There is a option at the bottom that says someone can propose alternative sampling methodology for EPA to potentially approve for their specific site. And our understanding from talking to some of the different labs is some of the test methods that EPA listed may not necessarily make the most sense for biogas or RNG. And so that might be something producers are going to have to look into and work with those labs to see, okay, if there's an alternative test method that should be used, you may want to get that in front of EPA as soon as possible so that you are able to utilize that to meet your record-keeping requirements.
I think there was a lawyer at some point that said ambiguity almost always works in the favor of the regulated. I don't know that I always agree with that, but I mean, if you listen to what the panelists here have said, right, like everything is an alternative, right? Like what's, if everything on paper can have an alternative that can otherwise be approved, right, then we're essentially writing regulation based on industry standard, which maybe the lawyer was right. I think we have time for one more audience question.
Since they're going to be using biomethane, does that mean the heating value or BTU value won't matter in terms of calculating your RINs? You'll just use the methane content and multiply it by the 10, like 1,010 or whatever the standard?
Yeah, so it's 1,010 and higher heating value with the specified ASTM standard that they reference for that. And there's a conversion factor to get from higher heating value to lower heating value that the industry has been using, which is 0.903. But that was based on typical natural gas higher heating value to lower heating value. And so under biogas reg reform, that conversion factor has changed because the lower heating value of methane is 909.4. And so you're actually going to be using 909.4 lower heating value for methane to make that conversion. And in essence, instead of 0.903 factor, it's 0.9004 is the conversion factor to get to the RIN equivalent.
Yeah, I think that's something that is undersold. The RIN calculation conversion is changing, and so it's slight. But all of you that have financial pro formas based on 11.727 RINs per MMBTU, that's going to change under regulatory reform because of that to 11.6935, I believe is the number. Seems really small. It is if you have one facility in a small volume, but if you're a portfolio customer, I'm looking down at you, Randy, that is meaningful real dollars, that little bit, when you're talking about millions and millions of D3 RINs every year. So in your financial analysis, make sure that you're using that newer calculation for 2025 and beyond. I think maybe, can I make one more last plug is, if you're not talking to somebody, a third-party engineer, about all of this for your either existing facilities or your new, do it quickly, because I'm sure, Weaver, Eco, we're getting full of capacity. Like our third-party engineers, we're getting subscribed, and so there's a little bit of space left. But there's a lot of nuances. You can see all the nuances here. They change at every single facility. Everyone's a little bit different, and that's when we've been asking EPA a lot of questions, but there's a lot of just specific site information that how do you apply a lot of the things that we're talking about may differ depending on what your setup is. So engage now, start that process. I know Eco we did our first couple of site visits for existing facilities under BRRR this last week. And so we're really starting to get into this process. We don't have all the answers yet, but I feel like if we wait until every single answer is buttoned up before you start, it's going to be difficult. And my guess is a vast majority of these facilities are going to use the AMP process. And if there is a chance that EPA does not approve that, it's better to know that in July and August, if possible, rather than October, where there's a potential where you're going to have some RIN generation lapse, and that would be significantly expensive for all of you. So now's the time to be really digging into this and knowing we're waiting for EPA, we're waiting for guidance, but the sooner you can have that, the sooner you can get underway and get a schedule for your existing facilities. It's really, really important. If you're bringing on a new facility at this point, you're probably going to have to register under the new BRRR regulations anyway. So you'll be dealing with a lot of this for the new facilities as we go forward.
Yeah, I'll just quickly expand on Brad's comment there. Don't hold that just to engineers. You want to be having those conversations with everyone that you're working with on these projects. So if you're a producing asset owner, you definitely want to reach out to your off-taker immediately if they haven't already reached out to you. I think something that is going to help make things a lot more clear is setting up a roles and responsibilities matrix. That way, everyone is absolutely on the same page as to who's performing any number of different duties across the year. And then also to Brad's point, because these guys are getting full up, the off-takers tend to have really long existing and deep relationships with both of these entities. So they might be able to help get you a little closer to the front of the line, so to speak.
All right, we're at time. So is it fair to say that we shouldn't be expecting any more guidance out of EPA? We're sort of working with what we're working with, right? So to Brad's point, we're not holding any marching forward for EPA at this point. We do expect that we'll see some of these initial AMPs, both project specific and generic, for lack of a better term, coming out this summer for people to start looking at and maybe streamlining their work. If you're an existing facility, you need to get your act together if you're not already doing it. July 1st is around the corner. And if you are a new facility, expect to be under the new rules at this point. Is that fair to summarize? Awesome. All right, we are going to swap panels. Please give these guys a hand for all this awesome information. All right, we're gonna take a stretch break, about 3 to 5 minutes while we get our LCFS panel situated up here. Please stick around though, because we are details on California LCFS, we're just going to do a quick swap. see if everybody who's going to stick around for LCFS, if you guys want to find a comfy chair. We're waiting on Natalie, and then we'll get rolling here. All right, I see Natalie's making her way back up, so we're going to go ahead and get started just so that we don't lose time or run in just a few minutes behind. So this is part 2 of our closing session. So if you guys are just joining us, this is the LCFS portion. We, as I mentioned at the top of the last panel, we wanted to do these for a more detailed opportunity to get really weedy on some of these big regulatory changes. And so we're going to go through and we'll do some introductions of the panel here in a moment, but our intent for this session is to cover the California LCFS changes, the current draft rulemaking, what is buried in there in terms of significant industry impacts, some specific recommendations, and maybe some predictive conversations about where we think CARB might go as they finish up this rulemaking in the next few weeks and months. And then also want to touch on how all of those things that I just talked about are impacting project development. What are we actually doing with the information that's coming out of California in the LCFS program, or what should you be doing as you consider it? So I'm going to give Natalie a minute to get settled, and we'll start at the other end of the table. So John, if you just want to give a brief introduction on where you are and why you're here for LCFS.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, everyone. John Danan. I'm a managing director at Generate Capital. Generate Capital is a developer, owner, operator of sustainability infrastructure across all of sustainability. I lead the waste and water investment team, and I've been involved in biogas projects since 2016, investing in food waste in 2016 and dairy waste since 2019. That's a brief overview.
Richard Corey, with a partner with AJW, consulting firm focused on energy transition, and a consultant to ABC. Last year and a half, been with AJW. Prior to that, I was with CARB, and for 37 years, the last 10 as the director of the agency.
Thanks. Natalie?
Hi, I'm Natalie Hoffman. I'm also with Weaver. I'm Director of Energy Compliance Services. You met Ashley and Michael. Besides the work they do with biogas reg reform and the RFS, we also have, I lead our consulting practice, our LCFS consulting practice. They are on the other side, the verification and validation side. And, we do the regular things that LCFS consultants do. We help people with estimated carbon intensity reports. We help them with their fuel pathway applications, monitoring plans, interface with CARB, all these kind of things. And I'm also a member of the board of the ABC, and I'm co-chair of our Ag Committee led by Brian Sievers. By way of background, I'm an LCFS verifier. I'm accredited as a verifier. I'm a lawyer. I'm a member of the California Bar. I've been consulting on the LCFS since it went into effect in 2011.
Awesome. Thanks for the intros. So as you can imagine, we have a lot of experience up here when it comes to California LCFS. So we're going to extract as much as we can out of the three of these folks up here with respect to these major changes. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in this room that when the LCFS moves, people pay attention. And the last year and a half has been there's been no shortage of major upheaval in terms of draft regulations. So I'm going to pretend that those in the room have not been following what has been going on, and we're going to baseline like we did on the last panel. And I will ask maybe Richard or Natalie to just give us a 30,000-foot view bullet point of what are the major milestone changes that CARB has proposed in the current draft rule.
Sure, Heather, I'll start. And just stepping back, one step back in terms of why the changes. What's the primary motivation for the changes is the scoping plan called for under AB 32. First scoping plan was done in 2008. Basically, what is the strategy in collective strategy for California to meet its GHG reduction targets? That plan's updated every 5 years or so per statute. The last update was adopted by the board in December of 2022, and it called for, characterize how the state had come along with meeting its original 2020 target, 6 years ahead of schedule. But basically, because subsequent legislation had been adopted for a 2030 target, 40% below the 1990 emission level, and carbon neutrality by 2045, the scoping plan was updated to reflect that and basically posed the question that the 2030 target, AB 32, wasn't sufficiently stringent enough to put us on track, to stay on track to achieve carbon neutrality. So it called for a 48% reduction below 1990. So that plan set in motion the need for additional rulemaking and the need for tighter increasing the stringency of the programs, including really the benchmarks of the climate program, the low carbon fuel standard, cap and trade, and some of the key motor vehicle programs. So from that, and there had already been some workshops, but basically to your question, Heather, really it was, how does the state extract additional reductions to fill that gap, to put the state on track to achieve the 2030 target as well as carbon neutrality? And it was informed by overperformance of the program, basically delivering more credits and deficits. As you all know, the basic structure of the program, traditional fuels generate deficits, carbon intensity gets tighter and tighter. Credit producers are basically used to offset those deficits. So the basic proposal was thinking about the rate of the accumulation of the cumulative bank, the onset of additional fuels that were being brought to market that were credit generators, the rate of carbon intensity reduction, basically innovation, to really advance a proposal to tighten the stringency of the program, to deliver more reductions, to take advantage of the innovation that's taking place. So that translated into a proposal to increase the stringency of the program by doing a few things. And this had not happened before. An initial step down, this is the current proposal, is 5% in 2025 versus the current proposal, as well as a year-over-year CI reduction to put the state on track for a 30% reduction in CI by 2030 and continuing on to 2045. That's the current 45-day package, the official proposed amendments. The package also included an auto accelerator mechanism, also a new concept, which was, rather than waiting, which takes about 2 years to go through a public process and go back to the board, hardwire within the design of the program a feedback loop. If there was overperformance, and it's defined, but overperformance meaning the cumulative bank continues to grow, and credits in a given year, there's more credits than deficits, that trigger a mechanism that would pull the entire stringency curve forward 1 year rather than having to go through a whole rulemaking process. So also a new concept that the staff workshopped and worked through the process. The other, with respect to biomethane, was a proposal to discontinue avoided methane. And the rationale was not that the underlying life cycle analysis calculations were flawed. It was basically acknowledging the role that natural gas has played in trucks in the state, the need for in-state reductions, so it's an inventory-based argument, and the need to have sufficient lead time. So it called for a step, basically a discontinuation for methane directly used as a fuel by 2040, 2045 for methane that's a feedstock to renewable hydrogen. There was a similar element too in terms of discontinuing book and claim, but it was defined as a discontinued book and claim for biomethane in instances where pipelines have connectivity to California over an annualized period, that the flows of gas are less than 50% over an annualized period. Raised many questions, and we'll be talking about that because it's a very high-level characterization that is not implementable from a regulatory standpoint yet. Last point, there are also some provisions on sustainability, particularly for crop-based feedstocks that were an alternative to establishing hard-based feedstock caps. And there's also some language concerning medium and heavy-duty charging, as well as a few other provisions. Those are the key elements.
It's just a few. So I think the big ones, so because that's a pretty lengthy list, I'm going to boil it down and then we'll go through each one. Do you want to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for that. From the point of view of the RNG, biogas and RNG industry, I just want to add something that's important and hasn't been resolved yet. And I want to exhort everybody from companies to take, and particularly California companies, take meetings at CARB. If you know CARB board members, please get involved, talk to them too. Anybody that's been following this rulemaking knows that part of the reason for getting rid of avoided emissions crediting for biomethane and its deliverability requirements, but primarily the AEC, is the environmental justice community. They just hate biomethane, and they've come at it. They don't give up no matter what. So when CARB put out its proposed text in December, it maintained biomethane, the avoided emissions crediting for a period that Richard talked about. If your project breaks ground before 2030, you can get the full 3 10-year periods that you can get now. If you break ground after that date, then you're constrained, the way that Richard said. What I wanted to bring up that is additional, and why I was saying that people should really get involved now. One of the things that came up in the workshops, and there were 9 of them over a 3.5-year period, this has been a very long rulemaking, was the dairy and swine manure RNG producers asked for a true-up. Because a true-up from the temporary CI score, which in the case of dairy and swine projects is a -150, the temporary value, and the average CI score once these projects are certified is -350. The way the LCFS is right now, if your certified value, your provisional score, is much lower than what the temporary value was, you don't get any credit for the difference, 200 in this case. A lot of credits, a lot of money. But if your verified score is lower than your certified score, CARB will take away credits, but they don't give you back credits if your temporary score is lower than your certified score. So the dairy and swine RNG producers have been asking CARB to make a true up. And part of that is because these pathways take a very long time to be certified. They may take, could be 2 years. Everybody goes through the tier 2 process. On this, it could be 2 years, very long time. There have been turnover at CARB. People have left. It's taking longer than ever. So this is very important. So what I want to highlight is I just found out within the last couple of days. So we thought we were going to get this true up. It wasn't in the proposed text, but there have been ongoing conversations with CARB, and we thought we would get this true up. Environmental justice community is very unhappy with the proposed text because of the continuation. If you break ground before 2030, you will continue. You can have 30 years. You can be going to 2060, generating credits with an avoided emissions credit. So apparently, CARB is considering only granting the true up from the temporary score to the certified score if the dairy and swine manure RNG producers will give back what they got in the proposed text. If you break ground by 2030, before 2030, you have up to 30 years of generating credits with an avoided emissions credit. The industry would have to give that up, and there'd be a hard deadline by 2045, no more AEC. So I think it's really important because there is still an opportunity, I think, to change CARB's mind on it. That was the one thing I wanted to say about our industry. There are a few other little things, like they're going to expand a zero emission vehicle infrastructure. They're going to expand it to medium and heavy duty vehicles. They added a tier 1 hydrogen simplified calculator, some other things.
We're just expanding on the "that's a lot" comment, I think, right? But it's interesting and new information, I think, for most of us in the room on the true up, which I appreciate. It's an interesting proposition. I think that they think that you would give up 20 years of avoided methane credits to get 24 months of a delta between provisional and certified or temporary. So, yeah. No.
Oh, sorry. My point on this is getting details. I mean, I heard about this. I want to have some direct conversations because on its face is, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. But on the other, I also know that the program's amended every 2 or 3 years, right? So also think about, and again, that presents some challenges. There's certain elements, and I think the program and staff is sensitive about certainty and investments, but the fact of the matter is, program progressively gets tighter, no doubt about that. Program gets more restrictive, no doubt about that. We have a history and facts on this thing. So I think when I hear a question like this, I always think about there's a risk calculus here in terms of what do you bag now and what are the relative economics of those trade-offs. In other words, what's the delta between the conservative provisional, between the verified, how much lower than that, how much more can I actually bank otherwise? So I'm just thinking about those questions versus a absolute answer. The kind of calculus I'd want to go through individually is understand that trade-off and have some follow-on with staff to make sure that I understood who proposed that option, because sometimes there's staff conversations, it's a big organization, and there's policy and leadership proposals versus conversation, and sometimes things are lost in translation. It's really important to understand.
So Ryan, go ahead.
With regard to this issue, is there still a potential opportunity for us to comment and submit a letter, and will it make any difference if we do? And as developers as well as industry representatives.
Yeah, somebody said on the last panel, an organization had submitted something to EPA, forgetting what it was exactly. And I think it was Ashley Duplessis said, but I would ask other organizations to make comments. I'm a firm believer in that because CARB counts the number of comments. Every workshop, they've said how many people are attending, how many comment letter. The formal comment period closed on the last April 10 workshop, but people are still having meetings, and I believe it's very important to submit a letter from as many organizations, many companies, as many regulated entities that will be affected by it, and particularly California companies, because I think they pay attention to that. They don't want to have stranded assets. That's very important to them. So I think, yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah, not a formal docket, obviously open right now for anything. It's a sort of rumor at this point, but
It's a pretty well-founded rumor.
so I think that there is an opportunity, and I think we'll be organizing. I think after today, I see both John and Richard have thoughts on the tip of their
I'm
tongue.
going to add to this a little bit because there's the formal process, right? So a workshop's not a formal reg process. They tucked a workshop in, but the comments still matter, but they're not formally in the right rulemaking record. But there's the 45-day package. Several folks commented. What's going on there is you're getting comments in the record, which are useful to staff, right? Particularly when there is a consensus, a broad-based consensus. So what you see, comments sometimes by virtue of competitive issues and so forth are very different. In other words, they dilute one another, they offset one another, they are less impactful, where there's other series of comments where there's some common ground. Pretty broad-based range of stakeholders are commenting in a common issue and specific versus just identifying a problem. That's easy. I have a proposal and specific outcome that's consistent with the policy objectives the agency's trying to achieve. So getting those letters in, there'll be subsequent amendment staff proposals. We'll talk about that a little bit. But the opportunity, to your point, it's really now and in the next few weeks, and it takes a few forms. One is just as you noted, it's a comment letter, and even though a comment letter submitted right now won't end up on the website, it won't formally be posted, it's still useful. What's also useful, sometimes even more useful, is to sit down with staff, because they're looking for solutions. They hear problems all the time. Here we see an issue, and here's a path. We've looked at your language, and we can show you a solution. Here's the problem, and a proposed solution that is responsive to the policy objectives you're trying to achieve. That's where a lot of comments and folks, frankly, that come in, I've seen a lot of these over a few decades, fall short. The ability to translate into solutions and kind of guide away and not just leave it to chance and hope that by virtue of identifying a problem, it'll work out.
All right, John.
Yeah.
Let's get John in here.
Wait, just to confirm, Natalie, this is like fresh in the last 72 hours or something, right? Since we've been here.
Last 72 hours.
Yep. No, it's somewhat discouraging news, but we submitted letters on Friday, which was the last day to submit for the workshop. But separately, we spent a lot of time in the building in Sacramento and talking to staff and talking to board members as well. And so we just have to keep on doing that. One of the things we asked for in the letter was end the rulemaking. It's gone on long enough. We're in a relatively good position, certainly relative to December 2022. We're actually much better than where we started. We're going to talk about that, I think. But it's time to end. But that means, to what Richard said, the next few weeks are crucial, because I think the end is either June or July board meetings, right? So in response to the trade and the trade-off, though, the point that we repeatedly made, us as Generate and AMP Americas and the industry, I think, on this was, this is real infrastructure. It costs a lot of money to put it in. You need a long time to pay it back and make a return. And there's been a bit of misinformation that this is cheap, you get paid back in 2 years and everyone's printing money, and that's not how it works, especially not at 40x, $40-something prices. And so the point we repeatedly made is this is real infrastructure. It needs real infrastructure like life, which means 2 decades. So you need those periods. So every project is different, but when I hear sort of should we trade the near term year or two for that, we can't. Like, you can't risk that. Or we're just not going to invest in anything new. And that's also the message we've given. 2 messages. One, you'll be stranding a lot of infrastructure and really upsetting the private sector. And 2, no one's going to do anything more, not just in biogas, but across the program. They will think twice. All the other technologies, all the other pathways.
So I think looking at this tee-up of long-term versus short-term, right? We're talking about it with respect to this new true-up information. But if we look at the rulemaking in general as what I would consider long-term impact, short-term impact, I would put our long-term impacts on some of the sunsetting, right? We talked about the sunsetting of the avoided methane credits, the sunsetting of book and claim and transitioning to deliverability. Those to me are long-term, right? We're talking about into the next decade. And then we have short-term, which are all of the accelerator mechanisms and the step down percentages and what I would consider near-term stringency targets, which are looking to course correct the market value in the near term. So maybe a question for John on this one, which is if you look at the near-term impacts or the proposals and that timeline of 2030, right, of maybe being more or less unimpacted, do we think that those 2 timelines are aligning well enough to continue moving investment in the rest of this decade? You essentially have a no harm, no foul kind of mentality on things like deliverability, but you also have a really overzealous credit bank that needs adjustment.
Yes.
So what does this look like in the near term? And then we'll pivot.
Can we step back and explain the credit bank first?
Yes,
we need
please. Go
to
ahead.
do that. So the credit bank, LCFS credits are evergreen. They don't have vintages. They don't time out. And so every time there are more credits than deficits, a credit bank builds. At the end of the year, the regulated compliance parties retire the amount of credits they need to, but if more credits were made than deficits, there's a bank that starts building. The bank currently stands at 23.5 million credits, thereabouts. That is 105% annual production. For reference, LCFS credits are a commodity, effectively. They trade like a commodity. In most active commodity markets, when the inventory of that commodity is 25 to 30% or more of annual production, the price plummets. Oil, corn, real macro global commodities. We're at 105%. That is why price is under 50 and falling. Right? So that's, in the one hand, that's a good thing because CARB sees that and says, okay, we get it. But I just wanted to frame the credit bank there. Okay, so the question was, is it enough? Are the proposals enough?
Yeah.
So maybe lay out the proposals. The current target stringency for 2030, a proposed target, is 30%, and that means 30% less than the 2010 baseline. So when you hear us say 30%, that is a tonnage of carbon avoided, right? If you're not all familiar. When we say a higher number, that's more tons avoided. And the proposed step down range from the workshop, and step down is we're going to step the target down aggressively starting in 2025, make a big leap for 1 year. And the proposal is to leap 5%, 7%, or 9%, right? That was the workshop. So effectively, if the change every year is like 1.5%, they're going to make like a 3, 4, 5 year leap, at the beginning of 25. Fun fact, new data came out right after the workshop. As we went into the workshop, our view was 30% by 2030 and 7% is okay. 8% is probably really good, and 9% will really help reduce the credit bank. As the credit bank starts to reduce, price will start to go up. Or 32% target and maybe a 5 or 7% step down would also work. You increase the higher number and the step down doesn't have to be so big. What we submitted in our letter on Friday was 30% needs to be 9 to 11% step down because the new actual real credit generation data came out a week after the workshop, and it was bigger than anyone expected. The credit bank is getting bigger at an accelerating rate. That means prices going down more. that means the step down and the impact the CARB has to do has to be more than they anticipated because the data is running away from them. So where our view, and we've done a lot of analytics on this, and we share it with everyone to sort of go through it, and it's in our public comment letters, is that, 5, 7, 9. 7 is probably what they were thinking. It's not going to be enough. It needs to be at least 9, given the accelerating pace of the credit bank. All right, that was a lot. I'll pause.
So thinking about if you get what you're suggesting, like let's just call it 9% and 30%, right? That initial step down, 30% by 2030. And you see the cliff at 2030 for the other things that kick in. Are any of those just enough to go, I'm out? I mean, if you get some of those near-term course corrections in the market pricing, is there enough market support in a corrected bank and pricing scenario to still draw supply into the market, knowing that the cliff is coming at 2030?
The cliff is coming in the sense that right now, if we build before 2030, we still get 3 periods, right? So that's fine. We'd build before 2030. That's great. You wouldn't build anything after 2030 realistically, until you had a longer operating time horizon, or you wouldn't build. Sorry, let me take a step back. You wouldn't build a project knowing that you were going to put your gas into the LCFS. If you had another market, you'll build the project. That's just quick clarification. We expect there to be other markets to go into before 2030. So I don't think anyone throws in the towel because we expect all these other markets to come. And I think you still under the paradigm I just said, if you get 30% and 9 to 11 step down, you're still building because there's all the other support mechanisms. The ITC helps a lot, and maybe you get some of the other IRA benefits, but also maybe you start to get contracted offtakes in other markets or other state LCFSs or. So there's, as much as we're going to focus on LCFS, there is a bigger picture outside that affects the longer term strategy as well.
So looking at the wish list, I'll call it that, short-term wish list, the 9%, the step downs, 30, et cetera, right? To Natalie or to Richard, knowing your conversations with CARB, maybe what we've seen in terms of the data at the most recent workshops, and the data that came out after the workshop, what is the crystal ball of CARB leading into something like 9 to 11%? Do we think that they will take that new data in hand? And I know they alluded to maybe being comfortable with 9% at the workshop. What are we looking at in terms of predictability?
I mean, I was thinking about John's point and had the same reaction to the additional growth of the cumulative bank based on Q4 2023. I actually thought it was useful. I thought the timing was helpful given the state that the rulemaking was in. And at the time CARB had the workshop, they were leaning towards the lower end of that range. I mean, they were going to increase the step down. That's pretty clear, the direction that they were going in. That increase in terms of the cumulative bank, that's pushed them in the direction towards 9. Do I think they land at 9? I'm not sure. I think we have a good shot at 8. And I think related, although this is not as significant, but I think it's relevant here, is that what CARB talked about in the workshop was increasing the 2025 step down, but they held the 2030 target at 30%. So effectively, the year-by-year slope was actually shallower. And the rationale needs to be, and we've advanced this conversation, I've been having it with CARB, the step down and the year-over-year stringency go together. Both of those are important. You increase the step down significantly, but the year-over-year CI reduction shouldn't have been shallower, should be at least what was in the 45 days. So a 9% step down translates into a 34% reduction in 2030. So those 2 points go hand in hand, as does, which I think is less significant practically, but I think from a market signal standpoint, pulling the effective date for the accelerator forward 1 year so that 2025 data could be the basis for triggering the accelerator is also, I think it's a useful message.
Do you want to add something, Ash?
I just wanted to ask Richard, we were talking about getting, people taking meetings at CARB and putting in letters on this true up of the temporary. Given that the data did come out after the workshop, do you think it's worthwhile for people to take push CARB on this too in meetings, maybe send letters on this?
Yeah, same point I made earlier in terms of letters and conversations. They'll take meetings. They don't have
They're not
constraints. Theoretically, they can take meetings. They're not precluded from taking meetings. And the point that I made inarticulately before was on this, I'm going to characterize it as the alleged staff proposal trade-off. I need more evidence on that and some conversations because big agency and I've had thousands of times people report conversations back to me that staff or others have had. You dig in and it's not what it appeared to be.
Yeah,
so
this is not written down, by the way.
It's basically having the conversations and understanding and honestly multiple conversations with folks, the kind of thing that the association members do. That's what helps us, right? And to your point, Natalie, letters, documentation, the point that I made, and meetings, all those elements are the greatest opportunity to influence change and to do it early in the process as possible. The point that we made, by the time staff puts out the 15-day change language, I mean, we're basically, the degrees of freedom to influence the outcome at that point have shrunk dramatically. In fact, then you're in a trade-off mode because if you're still arguing for changes and staff is receptive to those changes, it's an additional 15-day process. You just extended the process and made it longer and longer and longer before the rulemaking gets landed. So there's some trade-offs here too.
So you alluded to, you were going to say something now.
I was just going to say, and I don't think, so Matt Botel is the chief of the division to which the LCFS reports, and he said publicly that this amendment is going to get done by the end of 2024 and 2025. To your point about whether it'll be possible to do something after the 15-day, I don't think so, because the way things work, the board has to adopt this regulation once the final text gets done after the 15-day period. The board has to adopt it, and then there are regulatory steps that have to be complied with in California. So it isn't just the board adopts it, okay, it can go into effect. So there are things that have to be done before it can go into effect by the end of 2024, 2025. If they start another 15-day period, that won't happen, and the chief of that division has said publicly it's going to happen. So I guess, again, to his point, now is the time.
So on the discussion about affecting change, right? Not only is time of the essence, but there's a limited scope of changes that we are focused on actually accomplishing in what's left of the runway here. And so we talked near term, right? Which is all of these step downs, percentages, accelerator mechanisms. But we sort of left the long-term things aside as an industry, right? The things about sunsetting avoided methane, the things about deliverability. It was long conceded last year that those were not the movable objects, and that the near-term push that you guys have discussed is really on all of these market correction mechanisms. Is there anything else other than the step down, the accelerator mechanism, and maybe this true up concept that we think is actually a movable object in the last throes of this rulemaking?
I would say not unless we want it to go all the way to the end of the wire and the end of the year, right? I mean, again, we've sort of, our view has been from where this started in December 22 to where we are now, prior to getting this new data, right? Like, this is great, and we just need it closed. We need certainty. Even if they come in at 5 and not 7 or 9, we need certainty. We just need to know. I think if we open up something else, it's going to open up another round of comments. Like they're not just going to let our side of the argument weigh in without giving a chance to the other side to respond. My gut is no, just because it's taken so long to get here, or that it would be somewhat Pyrrhic if we tried.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, I mean, there's clues already. Look at the scope of what was included in the April 10th workshop. So you had a pretty lengthy staff presentation. I think it was 65 slides. You had EJ representatives that opened it. They took their position that there should be a sunset on voided methane tomorrow. That bucket claim should end immediately. And you had staff, which if you go through the presentation, there are very few elements that they were talking about that are part of the staff proposal. They talked about sustainability and increased stringency. What you didn't see staff talk about in the presentation was comments on the avoided methane provisions, comments on book and claim. You had a half dozen board members listening to that board meeting. A good portion of that presentation was to push back on EJ-related claims, provide the board political support and the underpinnings of the technical analysis that basically shores up the low carbon fuel standard as a counter to the narrative that was advanced by the EJ representative. That's what was going on. But it is the field in play is pretty narrow at this point. And to John's point, realistically, and we'll get to predictions a little bit later, but I think the voting board meeting is probably not as soon as people think it's going to be. So there's not really going to be room on the back end for additional even tweaky changes. We're really getting down to the final hour for those 15-day changes, and it's going to be about an up or down vote with the board, and we'll talk about predictions in a minute.
All right. Before we go future looking, I'm going to do one more technical review for those in the room. So automatic accelerator mechanism. We've mentioned it a couple times in passing, but I want to dig into it for a minute because it is its own ball of wax, just like the step downs, in how it operates, when it might trigger, how it might trigger, if it triggers, when does the market actually get to see the results of the changes that come with the accelerator mechanism. So help the room understand that new tool in their toolbox.
Sure, so I'll take a stab. So the concept, again, is to have within the construction of the low carbon fuel standard an automatic feature in the event, and I'll go back to define this, in the event of sustained overperformance of the program, the stringency self-tightens. Rather, because normally increasing the stringency of the program, we'd be going through the whole process again. Public comment, staff proposal, board meeting, board vote. The idea within certain boundaries, because the CARB board's not going to sign a blank check, right? They're going to allow, I believe, a certain increase in stringency, but then you get to there's the parameters on how far they would go without requiring a public process and a board hearing. But the current proposal basically says, first year, 2026, if the 2026 credits cumulative bank are greater than over 2026, the average of 3/4, I think it's the 3/4 average of deficits, 3-to-1 ratio, and more credits were generated that year than deficits, you've triggered the mechanism. In May, therefore, in May of 2027, CARB would notice the auto accelerator has been activated, and in 2028, it would be the 2029 stringency because you would pull the whole year forward. So that's the current proposal. And what we're suggesting, and again, I think it's more message, you could actually have 2025 be the first eligible year to trigger. And the argument would be that makes sense because the whole point of the step down is at least move us in the right direction in terms of bringing the market into balance. And for all the reasons John touched on, it won't be enough, but directionally, that's the idea.
So essentially, the step down that we talked about, the 5, 7, 9, whatever, right? That's our 2024 25, sorry, 20, we were in 2024, 2025 market correction. We ride out what that looks like in the market. We have to wait till May. It's not that the CARB is sitting on their laurels there. They have to wait for that annual data to be reported, and the normal reporting cycle is end of April, right? So May is the first. So May is the first trigger date when they could actually look at that data. And so we, in theory, don't need the auto accelerator mechanism as the first tool in the toolbox to be used, right? So the 579 that John alluded to is our first go. Hopefully that does what it's supposed to do, and this is the backstop. If that fails for some reason or is insufficient in drawing down the credit bank, then this AAM will trigger, and the industry is suggesting do that as quickly as possible. Natalie?
So, yeah, I don't think that the 5, 7, or 9 is going to bring the credit bank into alignment, because what we have going on in the LCFS is that what's driving the credit bank, the accumulation of the credit bank now, is renewable diesel coming into California. I think it's like 60% of the diesel pool in California, I mean, trucks that could use diesel, already using RD, number one. And what that means is every gallon of RD is used, so you have credits being generated, but no deficits. So deficits are going down at the same time that credits are going up. Biodiesel, that's only 20%. So when you're mixing biodiesel, you're generating deficits at the same time you're generating credits. That's not the case for RD. I think the production of RD quadrupled from 2021 to 2023. John, do you know how many gallons are predicted by the end of 2024 and 2025? Is it 5 billion? Well, it's something like that, 3 billion, and it's just going up. So I personally don't think, and I haven't modeled this out, but this is just my gut reaction based on what's happening, that the 579 is going to have the desired effect.
Yeah.
It's going to be necessary to pull it forward.
Before the new data, our model suggested 30% target and 7%, and you would be very close to tripping. And like we're not that precise in our modeling. You might trip, you might not. So we were suggesting 9. After the new data, we're suggesting 9, 10, or 11% step down is necessary to not trip. 9% now, you're very close to tripping because the bank is going faster than we thought. So yeah. So I mean, CARB is saying 5, 7, 9. I mean, we're really saying 7, 9, 11, right? Oh, really? 9, 10, 11. In our proposal letter, we said 9, 10, 11. So it's somewhere around 9%. Natalie, it may or may not trip is our current modeling. We don't have a crystal ball. That's the best I can say. That's why we said 9, 10, or 11. Real interesting thing about the mechanism, though. Let's say CARB does do 9. I think that means we drop down to what, 23% in 2025? Immediately? 20.
Is it
25?
22.75?
Yep. And so that means we have about, what, 1.25 every year until 2030, roughly. So we're only pulling 1.25 forward. So it may not be the biggest thing. We may trigger twice. This mechanism is super impactful post 2030. So for folks that don't know, the 2040 target is 75%, 4.5% each year. If this thing triggers in 2029 and gets activated in 2030, it is a 9% step down, which is gargantuan. So look, it may get changed and designed by then, but just that's a feature of it.
I think it's a really good point you bring up, Natalie, too, that we have our tunnel vision on biomethane,
Yes,
right? But this is a multi-fuel market, right? Yeah, there are other fuels here.
Credits are fungible, so what's going on in RD affects biomethane.
Yep. So I think that it's not in this rulemaking, correct me if I'm wrong, but the conversations about indirect land use as it relates to things like renewable diesel are being contemplated as other tools to, I want to say, restrict or otherwise limit the renewable diesel going to the market. There are also talks about caps and somehow managing renewable diesel maybe more deliberately, but those are not part of this package. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so as I think everybody that knows about renewable diesel knows, you have crop-based feedstocks, like soybean oil is the primary one, and then you have waste feedstocks like tallow, UCO, distillers corn oil. If you use a waste feedstock, you get a much lower CI score. And one of the things that CARB, again at the behest of another segment of the environmental justice community, they hate crop-based biofuels. They believe that people are burning down the rainforest to plant soy to make renewable diesel or biodiesel. So they are at it too. And so CARB, what CARB has done to make it very difficult to use crop-based biofuels is there's this concept of indirect land use, or ILUC. Without going into the details of that, the last time the database was updated that CARB is using was 2014. I think the 2015 amendment using 2014 data. Well, this was a theoretical construct. With all due respect to Richard, when he was exiled, it was a theoretical construct. And now we have actual data that we didn't have. So the indirect land use charge is too high, and the group at Purdue that created the GTAP model that's used to calculate indirect land use, they've issued papers saying instead of the 30 points of CI that crop-based soy has, for example, in the US, it should be 9. It's more than 3 times as high. So there, in this 65-slide presentation that Richard talked about, and I think they vocalized it at one point too, they said that they were open to doing something, but they just glanced over it and they didn't get into any detail. They were going to possibly be opening up ILUC, the indirect land use change. I don't see how they can do it now and get done with this, never. But could they have a separate rulemaking on that and without going through a whole?
A rulemaking is a rulemaking, so it'd have to follow the same process. But what I think they'll do, little prediction, you teed it up.
We're going there anyway. Go ahead.
The board's going to hear a lot about indirect land use, and it is an important construct, right? And there's certainly uncertainties associated with land use displacement and what the carbon implications are. But we do know that not considering it at all leads to really perverse treatment of different fuels. It just didn't make sense from the very inception of low carbon fuel standard. What I think will happen, there'll be certainly some discussion on this amongst the board, not in the context of specific amendments to this package, but I think the outcome of the board meeting will be direction to staff to basically reinstitute the advisory, some form of an advisory group, broad-based, technical, industry, academic, enviro, others, to really revisit this issue that really was a 2-year process many, many years ago that we worked on. And really, to Natalie's point, what do we know about the science? What do we learn from the process? Where are potential amendments warranted that potentially could lead to a future rulemaking? That'd be a few years out.
I'm sorry. Briefly, we got to give room for some questions.
No. I just wanted to say, speaking about things that can be impactful. So we're really far along in the LCFS rulemaking, right? We don't want to delay it. But there's another rulemaking going on at CARB, California Cap and Trade. Matt Botel is also, that's the same division that Matt Botel leads. Where I really think our industry, the dairy and swine manure people, should really get involved. The livestock offset protocol that is used, that CARB uses for the LCFS to calculate the avoided emissions credit, that comes out of something called the livestock offset protocol that was last updated in 2014. That was actually done in California Cap and Trade. There's this process going on now where people can get involved because there are livestock producers like Brian who raises beef cattle. He cannot get an avoided emissions credit for the manure, the RNG he's producing from his manure. So if there are developers that want to use beef cattle, want to use chicken manure, a lot of chicken manure, chicken litter, people interested, get involved in the Cap and Trade and ask them to amend the livestock offset protocol.
No, that's a fantastic reminder. Yeah, that doesn't live in see, I mean, it does now, but the underlying data is cap and trade driven.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it can have a real impact for our people.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes left before the mass exodus. So want to open it up to the questions for the room. What would you guys like to ask this panel? Certainly we'll do some more predictions to sort of round this out of what's next. What do we think is coming, crystal ball style? But want to give you guys questions first.
Thank you. So what does it look like after 2040?
I think program goes to 2045 and 90%, is that right?
Oh, that's my fault.
There we go. I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but you've got a regulation that gets amended every few years. So even though you've got a target, and you're right, in the out years, it's, I think, 4% or so CI reduction on an annualized basis, and it does conform with carbon neutrality in 2020, 2045. But what really matters, at least from my perspective, what do they do in the next few years? How significant is a 2025 step down? How significant is a year-over-year reduction between 2025 and 2030? After that, REG's going to get amended well before 2030. And so I wouldn't put much stock in the post-2030 step down, other than I don't see it getting less stringent. That's probably be a useful observation.
Yeah, and I'd double down on the point I made earlier. For the last, 10 Fair Oaks was the first project in 2014. So for the last 10 years, the only market to go to has been California LCFS. Fine, Oregon's there, Washington's there. That far out, I don't expect RNG to be, I mean, some will, but it'll be in a totally different paradigm. LCFS has had a monopoly on taking everyone's RNG. We have all built our projects for LCFS. There should be dozens more state markets. There's a question coming about a federal market, I'm sure. There should be other programs, stationary end use. We might have the hydrogen, the 45V. We are working to get methane accounting protocol into the greenhouse gas protocol so that corporates can actually claim CI credits. They can't do that today. If that happens between now and 2040, right? Like that's just a gigantic market. So agree with Richard that we shouldn't, like, the really good move was the 75% target by 2040. That should make us feel comfortable going into the early 2030s. That gives us 10 years to build other markets. That's more than enough.
Great question. Here you go.
For the dairy and swine, there was a recommendation to do annual cleanouts. Is that something we should address with cap and trade, or address to LCFS or CARB directly?
So that was tier 1. So that's not bundled here, right? So that's more or less done. Oh, go ahead, Natalie.
You know, in the new model, I think they are making you do annual cleanouts, but I don't remember right off the top of my head if it's in the livestock offset protocol or that's from another place. I'll look it up for you and let you know. Yeah, because that is going to cause a problem too, because every time you clean out the lagoon, you have to start again with putting in manure, and so your CI score goes up. Whereas if you leave the manure in there, you're generating more and more methane along the way. So yeah, that's not a good, exactly. Thank you for reminding me.
Other questions?
I think you wore them out.
Well, we've been 2.5 hours now, so if you stuck around for the whole thing, I wouldn't be surprised. So we'll wrap this up then with some predictive conversation. So we've heard a lot about new markets. We've heard about a litany of changes that are going to change market pricing, market dynamics. This seems like a year-over-year sort of wait and see kind of dynamic at this point. And we have the rulemaking process, right? So we have all of these things in front of us, I would say, between now and the rest of the decade. So just from each one of you, I think, what do you see in, I would say, the rest of this year as the things that you're waiting, like nuggets of information that you're waiting on from the rulemaking process? And then maybe if you're looking at, I know, John, you've sort of shared your vision for new markets as a solution, but if we look at California LCFS, both process and just its role in the market, what would you tell somebody in terms of next steps for California?
I mean, what we put in our letter, it's time to close. It's time to close it out, and 30% and 9, 10, or 11%, or 32% and 9% are the things that you've left open for changing. That's what we're saying. Given the update, I think we got to maybe make one more trip to Sacramento. Certainly a number of Zooms with the board members if possible. Final push, basically, right? I think is what I'm hearing, and it's imminent. It's not. I think I don't think we have to wait the whole year. I think it's the next few weeks.
15-day changes, basically the amendments to the staff proposal. Expect those to come out in summer sometime. Don't think it'll happen in June, maybe July. Board will end up meeting later than people think. They'll meet as late as they possibly can this year for a whole litany of reasons. So I think that's fall. September, October would be really difficult. Theoretically, it's possible to finish a rulemaking and there's a specific APA timeframe, but October would be pushing it. So 15-day changes comes out in the coming weeks or month, and then there'll be a break, because I think people will be looking for, why haven't we seen a board meeting scheduled for what we would have thought would have been July or August? It'll likely get played out a little bit. It won't be that staff isn't ready to go. It'll be other factors that are playing into that timetable. But to Natalie's point, and Rajinder and Matt and CARB team certainly needs and wants to land the regulation. I'm confident they will land it. And, they've been careful on how they talk about the regulation amendment being effective early January. There's some reasons why they're saying it that way, because it may not be January 1, but to be pretty early in that process.
It wasn't January 1 the last time, remember? It was January 4. Remember? The 2019 amendment was January 4.
I forget. I'm old. I forget.
Well, I agree completely with them. We really want the 15-day language to land this. The one thing I would say is, people think, well, we have all these other states. They're going to adopt LCFS type regulations. And so if we can't do it in California, okay, we can go to all these other places. I have a word of caution about that. Watching this, what happens in California tends to stick in other jurisdictions. And the environmental justice community is going after livestock manure, hammer and tongs. And if it gets into this thing the way they want it, or there's this trade-off, expect to see it in every other state. So just reiterating what we said before, get there early, get your comment letters in, go to see people.
That is a great point. It's another reason not to trade the true up for the long term.
100%.
Because it will, California leads the way.
Yeah, we're already getting questions from other proposed CFS programs of should they just start where California left off, right? Which is not where we want to go with new programs.
Well, not
certainly.
only that, they're busy and they like to use what California did,
yeah.
like Washington
makes
and
my
Oregon.
life easy,
So,
right? Surely California got it right. Yeah.
right.
Awesome. Well, without any other questions in the audience, we're going to close out the conference and the day and the session with this. So give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much for sticking around and engaging. And
I just want to say one thing. We wrote up a sheet. It's just a one-pager with an overview of the amendments. They're right here in the corner of this desk. If anybody wants it, come on up and take one.
Thank you. All right. Thanks all.